So my original plan for the mixed bag was to have the 5th video, the one on Skyrim, up for November 11th to celebrate the game's 10th anniversary. That is not going to happen. As with many a creator, I imagine, things come up and plans get postponed. I still plan on getting those done, but I do want to put in something for the anniversary. Therefore, I decided to touch on a subject in regards to the Elder Scrolls that I've been wanting to discuss for a while. Role-playing. As of today, there have been 10 years of playing and replaying Skyrim by millions of fans worldwide. During that time, Pillars of Eternity, Divinity Original Sin, and several other RPG properties have been released to invoke the likes of the original Fallout and Baldur's Gate. And over the years, a notion of what is and what is not a, quote, true RPG has come up again and again. Does it need dialogue trees? Should it be strictly on dice rolls? Is a party system needed? But more than specific mechanics, I believe it's more helpful to go over characterization in games, especially when working with a blank slate. To start, let's go back to the tabletop setting, where all the trouble started. You have your stats, class, and so on, but the personality is typically done by the player's own independent acting, often without any numbers or literal input in the systems at play. And the stats and personality tend to go hand in hand anyway. A fighter will tend to be confident and quick with a blade, a wizard tends to be more of a thinker, and a rogue will either be a random thrill seeker and or more than a little greedy. And there are little details that will never be shared between the DM and the player, maybe small preferences or tics that never come up, or something that the DM came up with in the background that the players will never catch on to. This exchange creates a very unique, arguably fragmented story that will never be reproduced, only retold in sparse details, an in-joke only a small group of people will ever chuckle at. Translating all this to a video game is complicated. RPGs, above all genres of video games, have always been the most ambitious as far as under-the-hood details go. Stats, reputation, and so on. Organic dialogue is impossible, so dialogue trees are established to fill in the missing pieces, lost in the translation between the table and the computer. When a Western RPG ends up being mostly combat and endless cutscenes in between, it feels disjointed somehow, more so than in an action game. To illustrate other forms of growth, reputation and approval systems are put in place to give pushback to your actions. That said, I've never been entirely convinced that number scales are the way of going about this. Words should have consequences, of course. But nickel and diming the player for every other line has its own problems, preventing me from truly relaxing into a role. For example, Dragon Age Origins has your approval rating with other characters. Having high approval also comes with combat perks, and certain companion-related quests won't come up until a certain level of approval. And to me, this only encourages making the right guesses and save scumming in dialogue, not role-playing per se. Disapproval only really feels like failure, not a valid answer, implying a lack of growth for the companion as well. And when a character is screwed over in the epilogue or gets a meh ending, it can feel like a more long-winded game over. Like this playthrough is now incomplete somehow. And why should dialogue be the only factor? Surely Sten would have noticed that we haven't exactly been losing, not to mention the army we've raised. Of course, there are multiple endings that don't feel like failures, but if you're not kowtowing to their every opinion, they can be just out of reach. And I don't think a half-assed ending is really justified after helping them confront their own demons or restoring their honor. As a result of the player character trying to appease everyone, they simply do not feel like a character. And even when you do stick to your guns regardless of what anyone thinks, you end up being static with little to no development. There is a gift-giving mechanic to help even things out, but it's far from elegant. Your friendship and your disagreement on tactical choices are generally not measured on the same scale. Like I implied, approval is complicated. Pillars of Eternity, on the other hand, only has flags at specific dialogue points for your companions. These are the points that affect the quests and their own personal outcome. And in a way, that makes sense. Most remarks between people end up being brushed aside, mostly for the sake of keeping the team together. And most of the time, the endings can't really be deemed as comparatively good or bad, so long as their respective quest is completed. The test here is your own personal philosophy, not whether you failed your companions or didn't give them enough cupcakes. So with all this talk of alternate endings, reputations, and approval, where does the Elder Scrolls series stand? Most of the games in the series have one ending to the main quest, and the gameplay itself does not end there. There are followers, but there is no party to speak of. And while there are reputation systems, they don't actually have a whole ton of consequences aside from the occasional snarl. Skyrim introduces factions who are at war with each other, but the differing outcomes comes from which one you choose, not with dialogue or any other factor. And even when joining factions in previous games did anger others, it amounts to very little. The real factors that truly come into play on a regular basis are your skills and your equipment and other racial abilities. Does this make it less of a role-playing game, though? Let's talk about Divinity Original Sin 2. The game plays fast and loose as far as companion approval goes. You can anger NPCs, but for your companions, it's more about specific flags rather than a number scale that you are constantly dwelling on. It does not escape all the usual problems, but the overall engagement with the characters felt more natural than others, less like a pop quiz. Then something happened when I beat it. There are a number of outcomes in the Epilogue, depending on your choices and actions. For example, I released the magic of Source to the world, which drove major villains into the abyss and led to a golden age that ended in another war. But then we get to the main character's ending.
And then there was you. You returned to the world a sorcerer among many. Your future was yours to decide. Did you accept your new status with humility?
The game basically tells you to think of one. Some might call this a cop-out, but it makes sense. Your background details, but for a few choices in character creation, are in your head alone. Your motivation, your personal goals, and your ending are entirely your own. And the other endings do come with unanswered questions. What started that second war? Were they between new nations? What was the Red Prince up to? Did he take part in the war? Did your whole party take part and perhaps end it? Entirely up to you. It opens every detail about the epilogue to reimaginings and interpretations. It was a true eye-opener on several levels. One of which was a complete deconstruction of one truism among the gaming community. That unless a game specifically responds to an action, it is not canon, not part of the story. And yet, here we are, an RPG that outright tells you to come up with an ending. My conclusion is not programmed in, yet I have one. My mental input is just as valid as what's on the screen, as valid as what's going on in a player's head on a tabletop game. The final words of that game establish a basic understanding of the player's part in all this. No DM knows every detail about the PCs, with 3 or 4 headcanons that will never truly overlap. More than any button clicks, Divinity Original Sin 2 understands that there is only so much a game can press upon the player character and let you mentally fill in the rest. And you know which series also understands that? The Elder Scrolls. After playing through DOS 2, I needed a palate cleanser, something easier and familiar after the difficulty and heavy moments of that game. So, I put in Skyrim. Knowing the game inside and out, I decided to really embrace what Original Sin 2 taught me. I embraced the little details, like finding the Shield of Ysgramor and making him a Red Guard Captain Skyrim. I had an alchemist vampire hunter marry the woman who grows her own Nirnroot, telling of a mutual respect for each other through a common interest. Those details may have only been merely implied by my own actions, but nothing was dismissing them either. This opened the game to all kinds of interpretations, and differences between playthroughs became much more stark. The game does not establish much, but it's just vague enough to allow your own imagination to take over. And it's not like nothing is ever established. The guilds you join and the tasks you do before the main quest create a backstory in and of itself. You could start slaying dragons as a complete nobody, or the leader of a faction, or that weirdo putting buckets on people's heads. Interpretation is a big part of the Elder Scrolls lore as well. Most of it comes from books you find, all of which written by an in-universe character. And their viewpoints are biased and should be taken with a grain of salt. Was Berenzia like that? Up to you. The Elder Scrolls themselves are nebulous entities, and your character needs to be viewed in the same way. And there are other strengths that the overall series has that I didn't give much credit to until very recently. It is a very malleable playset, and we could go on about skill systems, mods, and even expansions, but there's one detail about the series that is often overlooked. Everything is optional. See, your character's growth and main story of most RPGs often go hand in hand. In, say, Pillars of Eternity again, there are side quests, but the bulk of the content, experience, and equipment is acquired through the main quest. And while the side quests are optional, you are still obligated to at least address them for further stat growth. Skipping out on a quest entirely is never a wise decision. Expansions are also often tied to the main quest as sequels, seldom as standalone stories. This is simply not the case in the Elder Scrolls. I've seen many players take the attitude that you have to do everything in Skyrim in a given playthrough. It's there, I obviously need to poke it. But the truth is, you are under no obligation to do the guilds, the main quest, or even any quest at all. All experience comes from skill usage, and you can find equipment as powerful as anything you find in the main quest on your own. You don't want a character that masters everything, or joins guilds? Don't. You could just do the Dawnguard questline and not bother with the dragons at all. The final note of a given playthrough could be slaying Alduin, or summoning Karstag just outside the Thalmor Embassy, or just finding the last Dragon Priest mask. It's this kind of flexibility that keeps me coming back to the Elder Scrolls, even after I've memorized every line of repeated dialogue and the various flavors of jank Bethesda is famous for. The differences in the order of events, marriages, skills, what is included and what is not, speaks of more varied playthroughs than any number of epilogues or dialogue choices. In conclusion, yes. The Elder Scrolls games, by letting the player mentally impress upon their character, playing with skills as well as ending on their own terms, are RPGs. Your canon is up to your interpretation, whether it is where the character stands at the final save point, or their life before waking up to rolling cartwheels. The player is the ultimate decision maker for how the character's story plays out. The series, especially Skyrim, has been under a lot of scrutiny over the past 10 years, and I will never say that they are perfect games. And the future of Bethesda, while not doomed per se, is more than a little head-scratching at times. I mean, seriously, how many times do you need to release one game? But instead of yet another video about how such and such is garbage and here's why, I say, here's the 10 years of Skyrim. and many more beyond Oblivion and all that came before. Thank you for the dragons, the monsters, the locales, and everything in between.